White Star Gun is arguably one of the strongest Gear 5 attacks we've seen. It's basically a choked up version of what Luffy did to Kaido, mixing Gear 5 with armament and Conqueror's Haki, then spinning and landing a clean headshot that actually goes through the opponent's brain. But with Kizaru, it was an aimed attack, where Luffy spun like a top and ended up completely losing his stamina as a result. Kizaru himself remarks how devastating this attack was, with the original Japanese of this scene having him say, "Korea ikan," which I think is pretty accurately translated as, "not good." Kizaru throughout Egghead is a very questionable figure, where there's a good case to be made that he isn't being serious. But this reaction is pretty hard to dispute, as Kizaru in his literal thoughts is saying that the White Star Gun had a huge effect on him. Here's where this video however gets interesting. Kizaru doesn't actually lose consciousness from this attack. Even though characters in One Piece rarely die from attacks, the manga is incredibly consistent with this one thing, where getting knocked out means that you are truly defeated, and it is pretty much the staple the story uses to signal the end of Luffy's fights. In Dressrosa, Doflamingo had multiple scenes where characters thought he was defeated, but he then surprised everyone by coming back, and the fight was only truly over after Luffy knocked Doflamingo unconscious with the King Kong gun. Luffy himself also has a lot of moments like this, such as during the Katakuri fight, where Luffy is left a complete wreck multiple times over, but because he remained conscious, Luffy was able to come back and keep fighting. This is not to say that One Piece characters can't get knocked out and snap out of it during fights, and this very often happens as well. I'm more so trying to point out that in the manga, a character is basically never actually beaten unless they've gotten their lights knocked out, which is exactly what did not happen with Kizaru versus Luffy. Kizaru was still very much in the game even after taking the White Star Gun, as does Luffy after eating a ton of food, and this wasn't the actual end of the fight. But in this second round of the fight, Kizaru honestly gets dominated. The fight after Kuma's flashback becomes a real kerfuffle, involving several other characters, where Kizaru has a new ally in Saint Saturn, and for the beginning of the fight, he's not even targeting Luffy but Bonnie. After he's pushed back by both Luffy and Sanji however, the fight becomes more focused, now just centered on Gear 5 Luffy and Sanji fighting Kizaru and Saturn. Luffy has however now learned his lesson from the beginning of their fight, as simply punting Kizaru off the island doesn't work. Luffy just decides to smash Kizaru into a pancake, then send him flying off Egghead like a frisbee. This is the move that finally does Kizaru in, leaving him out of combat for the rest of the arc. So, wouldn't this scene then clearly make Monkey D. Luffy the winner of this fight? Kizaru took a total of 3 Gear 5 attacks during the fight. He was also in very good condition before facing Luffy, where none of the other characters he fought on Egghead did any crazy damage to him, so this could be seen as a fairly solid victory for Luffy. This is especially if we consider that Kizaru was fighting alongside someone as strong as Saturn in the second half of the fight. What is even more impressive is that Luffy was able to keep going for chapters on end against the 5 elders even after Kizaru was defeated, meaning that Luffy still had a lot left in the tank even after he'd beaten an admiral. But despite everything I just said, I honestly think the real winner of this fight was Kizaru. If we go back to that final attack that Kizaru took from Luffy, the exact same thing that happened with the White Star Gun happened here, where even after the dawn symbol, Kizaru is still conscious and remains conscious until the very end of the arc. To be blunt, I do not honestly think that Luffy even came close to finishing Kizaru off here, but much more importantly, it has been confirmed that Kizaru was not only not trying to defeat Luffy on Egghead, but was actively helping him. The proof for this comes from One Piece SBS Volume 110, where Eiichiro Oda revealed that the one who gave Luffy his food in the middle of this fight was almost certainly Kizaru himself. While there were a lot of hints about this in the arc itself, this admission by Oda really seals the argument, where Kizaru during his mission was not only conflicted about being ordered to eliminate his friends, but he was deliberately aiding the Straw Hats so that it wouldn't happen. So, what does this mean for Luffy versus Kizaru? For starters, it means that Luffy never took Kizaru to his limit during this arc. After taking the last attack from Luffy, Kizaru tells the other marines to leave him be, because his wounds run deep. In retrospect, Kizaru is likely not referring to physical wounds here, but emotional ones. From thinking that he had killed Vegapunk, Kizaru was pretty obviously devastated by this, as in his final scene in the arc, He's a crying mess yelling at Akainu for not respecting what he's currently going through. I don't really like using the anime as evidence, but I can still point out that this was also their interpretation of Kizaru's character in this moment, where they even added scenes of him having visions of landing that final hit on Vegapunk. Another thing that points to Luffy having never taken Kizaru to his limit is that Kizaru was the only marine present who at the end of the arc managed to retain his consciousness from Joy Boy's Conqueror's Haki blast. This was by far and away the strongest use of Conqueror's Haki we've ever seen in One Piece, where it was strong enough to depower the Elders, to send most of them back to the Holy Land, and to even knock out New World Wise Admirals. Dory and Brogy later say that this Haki might have been even greater than Shanks's, which we've seen is in itself potent enough to seemingly depower Admirals. To top everything off, even Imu half a world away was left sweating after sensing Joy Boy's Conquerors in this chapter. While some fans might think that Conqueror's Haki only affects strong characters if it is imbued in attacks, this actually no longer appears to be the case in the final saga, where someone like Saint Valkyrie was for example able to affect Gear 5 Luffy by simply blasting his Conqueror's Haki. If Kizaru had truly been at his limit at the end of Egghead, I think there's a really strong possibility that Joy Boy's Conqueror should have knocked him out, yet it didn't. And Kizaru, despite his wounds, was still the only marine standing after experiencing it. Looking at all the damage he took on Egghead, it in retrospect would have honestly been incredibly weird if this was all it took for Luffy to defeat a Navy Admiral. I'll even go a bit further, by saying that it would make no sense for someone as strong as Borsalino to be defeated this easily. I said this before, but during the entire arc, Kizaru took a total of 3 attacks from Gear 5 Luffy. Even though Gear 5 is really powerful, there's still a limit to its power, where someone like Lucci at the beginning of this arc was able to take even more attacks than Kizaru from Luffy, and still be able to keep going. I probably don't need to argue this point, but I'd reckon that Kizaru is a fair bit stronger character than Lucci, where even Luffy himself in this arc clearly views the Admiral as the bigger threat. So, if Kizaru was indeed not at 100% during Egghead, and if Luffy never came close to finishing him off, then let me spin this question the other way. Does this mean that Kizaru on Egghead was stronger than Luffy? Say what you will about Kizaru, but there really is no question that Luffy himself was 100% serious during Egghead. Luffy promised to Vegapunk that he'll get him off the island, and Luffy is pretty headstrong about his promises, which we also see when he at the end of the arc is very down about thinking that he failed to keep his promise. Luffy also tells Kizaru to his face that he has to take care of him so that his friends could safely escape off the island. This is on top of the fact that Luffy has personal reasons to want to beat Kizaru. Luffy still holds a grudge over what happened at Sabaody, and swore all the way back in the pre-time skip that he wanted to defeat Kizaru. In Dressrosa, Luffy also declared that it is his intent to defeat all of the Admirals, where Luffy doesn't think that he can be the Pirate King if he can't do this. All of this is also clearly on Luffy's mind at Egghead, where he's downright gleeful at the chance to finally be able to rematch Kizaru. It's also pretty clear from the way Luffy fights that he is completely set on the idea of taking Borsalino out. He throws Kizaru into the sea, naturally seeing it as a certain way to finish off a Devil Fruit user, and Luffy is even shocked when Kizaru counters this. When Luffy performs the White Star Gun, he acknowledges that this attack will use all of his remaining stamina, and Luffy only ever does these kinds of mega attacks when he tries to finish his opponent off. If this wasn't strong enough evidence about Luffy being serious in this fight, Luffy even has dialogue at the end of the fight saying how frustrated he is that Kizaru won't go down. This is a bit of a side note, but I've actually heard that the director in the One Piece animation staff believed that Luffy was not taking his fight with Kizaru seriously. For me though, even if you are Oda himself, you can't argue against what is shown in the actual manga, where it trumps all other sources, and is clearly pointing towards Luffy being serious. If there is an argument for Kizaru proving himself to be stronger than Luffy during Egghead, it's definitely the first half of their fight. Luffy here is completely focused on fighting Kizaru, while Kizaru is mainly just trying, or I guess pretending, to take out Vegapunk. Yet this exchange ends with Luffy being completely out of stamina after the White Star Gun, while Kizaru is taking his fake break. And we now know that he was 100% acting, and that Kizaru was just using this opportunity to literally feed Luffy back to full power. I honestly think there is just one way to interpret this exchange. If Kizaru had wanted to, he could have given Luffy a knuckle sandwich along with those burgers, and basically made the One Piece story end on Egghead Island. If there is still one argument that could make Luffy appear stronger than Kizaru in this arc, it would be that he himself was weakened before his fight with Kizaru. This is because of the events of the previous day, where Luffy had fought both Lucci and the Seraphim. In addition to this, Egghead's environment also helped Kizaru in many ways, where he could do extra damage to Luffy by making him go through the island's laser dome not once, but twice, which Luffy said hurt him even in Gear 5. I think these are fair points, but I don't think they really make a difference. Luffy had an entire day to recover from the previous Egghead fights before Kizaru. At the beginning of the second day, we also see that Luffy was essentially stuffing himself with food. While Luffy had clearly lost stamina during the first day on the island, he has several times in the manga shown that he can very much go back to 100% in less than a day, as long as he's given food and rest. And really, Luffy's recovery in the final saga has seemingly also leveled up considerably, where he literally says that he is back to full power after eating the food Kizaru gave him in the middle of their fight. I think the case for the Frontier Dome weakening Luffy is fair, but it also isn't. In One Piece, fights practically never happen in some flat area where everything is fair for both combatants, but the environment almost always plays a factor. We see this in just about every arc, where fighters always use their abilities to suit the environment. Even if Kizaru and Luffy had fought somewhere else, I really don't think that would give Luffy a get-out-of-jail-free card in this case, since Kizaru could have instead, for example, kicked Luffy into the sea, which would be 1,000,000 times worse than the Frontier Dome. I would also like to highlight that there are plenty of arguments that Kizaru was also far from 100%, even beyond him being mentally conflicted during this mission. To be perfectly honest, I actually think Kizaru wasn't even mentally weakened in this arc, at least to a point where it would have weakened him in combat. Both Rayleigh and Katakuri say that you need to be mentally acute to be able to use Haki, but this to me proves that Kizaru actually still had his emotions in check during this arc, as he was still able to use his Haki. We see this when he's able to hurt Luffy's rubbery body with a blunt kick, and him being able to dodge Sentomaru, a Haki user, with his Logia abilities, which Katakuri says is something that literally requires observation Haki. However, Kizaru was clearly weakened against Luffy in other ways. He had just fought Sentomaru before Luffy, and Sentomaru had actually managed to hit Kizaru hard enough to make him bleed in this fight. If you're interested, you should click here to watch this video I did on this fight specifically, because I in it go through why Sentomaru is a legitimately really strong combatant, and that him being able to hold his own against an admiral was no fluke. What I also want to mention is that Luffy got several free openings on Kizaru in this arc, where Luffy was able to catch him several times because Kizaru was focused on Vegapunk. What the entire fight essentially is Kizaru pretending to take out Vegapunk, while also having to pretend to be taking his fight with Luffy seriously, whereas Luffy instead is just going 100% at Kizaru in every scene. I guess that ultimately is my conclusion. Looking at all of the evidence, Luffy was not the strongest monkey on Egghead Island. This fight between Luffy and Kizaru was a really long time coming, where it actually had over 500 chapters of build-up behind it. But I actually think that this was hardly the curtains for Kizaru's character in the final saga. If you're interested, you should click here to check out my full video about why Borsalino is legitimately set up to be a huge player in the final war, and why his character since the very beginning has been written for One Piece's endgame. Thanks a lot to all my members for their plunder. As always, I really appreciate everyone who watched this video to the end.